this morning, I'd like to turn into the book of John, chapter 10, and we're going to read arguably the second most famous passage in that book, because obviously we can't beat John 3:16. There's no beating that. But this is probably the second most famous passage in the book of John, and it's also one of the most famous passages in the New Testament as a whole. And so some of you already know where we're going just by that alone. But John chapter 10, and we will read verse 10. I'll also point out a certain irony. While it's one of the most popular passages, it's also probably one of the most misused passages. And by misuse, I don't mean that it's like being used to create some sort of corrupt system or deceptive thing that's causing great harm, but I just think it's slightly misquoted or slightly misconstrued, and we'll try to bring some of that clarification out as well as we talk. But John chapter 10, verse 10, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So I'll throw this out there right now. We'll build towards it, but I'll throw this out there just so it's kind of in there in your processing queue, or whatever you want to call it. You're able to kind of chew on this for a minute. But I'll say the part of this that I believe is somewhat misconstrued oftentimes is the idea of the thief. And normally what ends up happening is we quote this passage just like I did, without any other context, without even talking about where or how it's happening, who Jesus is talking to, and we just quote this as kind of a one-shot verse, and we say, there, Satan, the devil, is here, and he's trying to steal my stuff, and he's trying to kill me, and he's trying to destroy a bunch of things, maybe me too, but don't worry, but I am kind of worried, but don't worry, because Jesus has also come, and he's going to do other stuff that's good. And that's kind of like where we like hover around this verse. But there's a big Satan emphasis, there's a big devil emphasis, there's a big like, this is what the devil is trying to do to you, this is what the devil is doing to you, devil, 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 Satan, Satan, Satan. And that's kind of how the first half of this verse lives. And the second half is all over the map as well, but obviously it's in the positive or favorable direction of things. And so let's go to the beginning of the chapter and build towards this moment and try to see it in a fuller context and understand maybe what this is talking about. And without doing a ton of legwork, I will give you two, I'll say, contextual frames that are worth understanding before we even begin to read the chapter itself. And so the first contextual frame that I want to provide to you is the idea that this John 10, 1 through whatever, 1 through 10, 1 through 20, however far you want to go with it, this context is actually part of an exchange that just happened in John chapter 9. So there is no chapter break the way John was originally written. We've created chapter breaks and verses so that we can easily navigate and jump to verses and kind of know where we are quickly. But in John chapter 9, what unfolds is essentially this. There's a man who was blind from birth. He was born without sight. And Jesus ends up healing this guy who was born blind. This guy was a beggar his whole life. He was known in the community. He was infamous, if you will, as that's the guy who was born blind and now has been a beggar his whole life. And so Jesus ends up, this is classic Jesus crazy move here. Jesus ends up making mud in his palm with his saliva, his spit. So I don't know if you've ever done this before. You've made a mud pie. You probably have when you were a kid, but have you ever done it with your own spit? And the boys are like, yeah, I have. But anyway, so Jesus does this as a man. He makes his mud pie in his hand with his spit, and then he goes one step further than most of us have ever gone with this move. He took the mud pie made of spit and smeared it into a blind person's face over his eyes. And the guy doesn't get healed instantly, by the way. awkward. This is a weird moment. So then Jesus says, okay, now go and wash in the pool of Siloam. So there's a delay between the guy getting spit mud in his eyes and the washing that's about to occur, and then ultimately the healing and the eyesight restoration that's happening. So the guy goes to this nearby pool, this pool of Siloam. He gets healed. His vision is restored. Restored is not even he has vision for the first time in his life. And then people begin to recognize him. And they're like, weren't you the guy that was blind before? And you were begging? Aren't you the beggar? Aren't you the guy that kind of was like annoying to us? Like you were the community annoying person that we all kind of knew about, but we had pity on? Like, aren't you? And he's like, yeah, that's me. And they're like, well, how did this happen? And he's like, I don't really know. All I know is this guy named Jesus showed up, put mud in my eyes, told me to go wash in the pool, and now I have my sight. That's all I can tell you. So then and these are just like, I'll say kind of Joe and Jane community folk are kind of questioning him. So then they bring him to the Pharisees, the religious leaders. And they're like, hey, religious leaders, what do you think about this crazy turn of events? This guy was born blind. He was a beggar, blind his whole life, and now he has vision, and it was apparently through a miracle that Jesus performed. So the Pharisees start interrogating him, and they start asking, like, well, how did this happen? And the guy's like, look, I don't know. I'll just tell you I was blind and now I see, and it was Jesus that did it. They're like, well, who is Jesus? Like, what do you think of him? Was this from God, or is he a sinner? Like, tell us what you know about Jesus. And they're trying to put this guy on the spot. And he's like, I guess he's a prophet? I don't know. So then they go to his parents, and they're like, hey, mom and dad, was this your kid? Wasn't he born blind? They're like, yeah, we could tell you he was our kid. We could tell you that he was born blind. We can't tell you what happened and how he got his sight. We just know that he has his sight, and he didn't have it before. He never did. And his parents actually are very standoffish, and they kind of they keep the whole situation at arm's length, which if you try to put yourself in their shoes is kind of a crazy move to make. Like if your kid was born blind and is now an adult that has been blind his whole life, you'd think there'd be this like celebration, this rejoicing, this connection that's made in this moment where you're so drawn to and excited about what just happened and how it happened that you wouldn't think you'd distance yourself from it at all. But they do, and the reason is actually told to us specifically in John 9. It says they were afraid of the Pharisees, and specifically they were afraid to be put out of the synagogue, excommunicated. There are some of you that I've been considering excommunicating. No, I'm just kidding. But this was a real fear. So they were like, look, this isn't just like, don't worry, I'll go to the church down the road and it'll be fine. If we get kicked out of the synagogue in Jerusalem, we're blacklisted. We're now like, we're excommunicated in a broad sense. We're social pariahs. We're outcasts. This is an embarrassment, and this is a massive social and cultural burden and religious burden that we would now bear for the rest of our lives. So his parents don't want anything to do with that, and so they basically dodge the question. So then the Pharisees go back to the blind guy. Well, now the guy who can see, the guy who was blind. And they question him again, and ask him the same routine, the same interrogation, and the guy who's now got his sight says, look, we've been through this before. I have the same information that I gave you already. Are you trying to become Jesus' disciples? Is that why you're at? And the guy like is reading the room and basically poking at them now. And he's like, no, you want to be his disciple. And like they're fighting now. So they kick him out of the synagogue. They kick the blind guy, or the guy who's now got sight, out of their presence, and it's not clear if they excommunicate him permanently, but they at least boot him out of this immediate context. And so then Jesus starts to address the situation. And some of the Pharisees that were there were vehemently opposed to Jesus, and some of them were like, I don't know. I mean, we're not big Jesus fans, but it's hard to argue with opening blind eyes, especially blind eyes that were born that way. And so there's a split among the Pharisees that you don't often see. And so now Jesus is at the end of John chapter 9 and into John chapter 10 is addressing this group of people, the Pharisees that are divided about who Jesus is, whether he's a sinner, whether he's from God, whether he's a prophet. How did this miracle happen? He's addressing this situation, kicking people out of synagogues, being afraid of the religious leaders. He's addressing all of that, and then he starts to tell this story that we call a parable. So it's an illustrative story, and this one is called, most frequently referred to in our modern day as the parable of the Good Shepherd. So before we read any of it, let me give you, that was frame number one. That was a lot, wasn't it? Frame number two of context that's worth having. There's a guy, a theologian from a few hundred years ago, who did a bunch of study and work into this particular, he did actually quite a bit of study and work all over the place, but in this particular, I'll say social and cultural and historical context, he did a lot of study. His name is Samuel Bocart, if you ever want to look him up. But he did a lot of work to try to provide context into what Jesus was describing in this parable. And so essentially, here's kind of what his findings were. In Jerusalem, they had a bunch of different shepherds. Okay, so Jerusalem is a city. There's a bunch of people living there. It's obviously where the temple is. It's the center of Judaism of this ancient world. And so this is where all of kind of the Jewish economy and the religious Mosaic economy was kind of centered around Jerusalem and the temple. And so there's all these shepherds that are in Jerusalem, and they have flocks of sheep that they keep outside of the walls of Jerusalem. Take them out on the hills, find pasture, have them feed, and then at night, now you have to realize it was like a hand-to-mouth kind of economy. At night, when the shepherd now needs to go home and be with his family and then get some sleep, the shepherds would pool their resources, and essentially there'd be this fold, this walled enclosure, where all of the sheep of Jerusalem that had a shepherd would hang out for the night. And they'd only have to pay one doorkeeper, and they'd only have to pay for the upkeep and maintenance of one fold, because all of the sheep, this is kind of a community, like, hey, we can pool our resources. They'd all go to this one place, and they'd have one doorkeeper kind of watching however many sheep that was. And part of the economy of having the sheep, obviously there was wool and there was meat and there was all the natural things you'd expect, but there's also the sacrificial system. So if you're a Jew traveling to Jerusalem and you have to go and give sacrifice in the temple, and you're supposed to kill a lamb, well, I just traveled from wherever. I don't have a lamb, or maybe you don't own a lamb. So what do? You buy one from a shepherd and handle it that way, and you do that locally right in Jerusalem. So anyways, this is kind of the context of what the story, the parable of the Good Shepherd, the frame in which it takes place. So let's jump in and take a look here in John chapter 10, verse 1. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up some other way, he is a thief and a robber. Okay, so let me give you one key to this parable. And you could already pick it up just from this verse. One of the tricks of this parable is there is not a one-to-one mapping of characters in the story to characters in real life. Jesus is taking a multi-pronged approach. So he's saying, look, I'm going to give you two ideas for one concept here. There's two illustrations in this parable for one. So he is a thief and a robber. And you might think to yourself, well, that's the same thing almost. Yeah, kind of, but it's not. So a thief, and this is in the original Greek, was somebody that would take from you without you realizing. So like a pickpocket. Okay, so a thief is somebody that they somehow, through deception, through whatever cunning, stealing wickedness they came up with, they somehow, you had your watch on and now it's gone. You had your wallet in your purse and now it's gone. They broke into your house and they took something and you didn't even realize they were there until after the fact. Maybe they came in when you weren't home, maybe they came in when you were asleep, but somehow through cunning, they have taken from you without you even immediately realizing. A robber is also someone who's looking to take from you, take advantage of you, but you know it's happening as it happens. So this is what you'd say for like highway robbery. This is what you'd say if you were, robbed at gunpoint. This obviously didn't have guns, but same idea. This is the term, in fact, when Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan and the guy who's traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho gets robbed and beaten and left for dead in the ditch. He was robbed by robbers. He knew it was happening when it happened, and he got a good beating alongside the robbery. It was a very evident and obvious thing. And so Jesus is saying, look, anyone who comes in any way but the door is both a thief and a robber. There's a subtlety to their cunning where sometimes they'll take from the sheep without the sheep realizing. And there's until maybe after the fact. And then there's also the same character but different mode of operation. Sometimes you're being robbed, but there's nothing you can do about it because it's just happening right before you. Okay. But he who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. To him, the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. Pay attention to that. This is important. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. Remember, picture the system that this probably took place in. There's a bunch of sheep in one fold. Shepherd shows up and starts, I don't know what a shepherd call sounds like, making sheep noises. I don't know what they do. Help me. Is Amanda here? Judder here? Nope. He's shaking his head no. He's saying, don't even try. Okay, I will take that counsel. I will take that advice. However this works, they recognize the voice of the shepherd. And in fact, there's enough, I'll say, personal individuality in relationship and intimacy where the way this is being described at least, this shepherd even has the sheep named personally. And so there's a picture of an individual relational connection between the shepherd and each sheep, but also between the shepherd and the entire flock that the shepherd is over. So we'll highlight that now, but we'll revisit the thought later. Verse 4, when he puts forth all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. Man, knowing the shepherd's voice seems to be a key thing he keeps saying. A stranger they simply will not follow, but will flee from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. Jesus is hitting this voice metaphor every which way, both positive and negative, but he's trying to get the idea of knowing the shepherd's voice as a key ingredient in understanding this. So verse 8, this figure of speech, Jesus spoke to them, but they did not understand what those things were which he had been saying to them. So picture Jesus. He's trying to address this group of rowdy Pharisees and anybody else who's kind of standing by, and there's this whole situation with the blind guy who's now healed, and some of the Pharisees are questioning, maybe this is from God, but most of them are saying he's a sinner. Oh, by the way, he healed the guy on the Sabbath. So that was part of the big question mark for the Pharisees. How could someone ever do that on the Sabbath and it be from God, because he should have been not healing blind people, he should have been resting because it's the Sabbath. And so that was part of the drama, part of the controversy of this whole thing. So basically, Jesus gets halfway through the parable and he looks around and he's like, you are not understanding me at all. So then he's like, let me build this thing further. And he also, not only does he build the illustration further, but he also starts to name some names. He starts to identify himself in the parable. He starts to describe himself in the parable, and you begin to get a clearer picture. And Jesus is careful. He doesn't actually go and say, and you are the thief, but it's right in there if you're reading. So verse 7, so Jesus said to them again, truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came, well, let's stop right there. I am the door of the sheep. Now remember, I said that Jesus is taking a multi-pronged approach here. So he's going to identify himself in multiple points and symbols through this story, and he's also going to identify other people at multiple points and through multiple symbols of this story. But the first symbol Jesus directly identifies himself as is the door to the sheepfold. So picture this walled enclosure. It's designed to protect the sheep from what? Well, it's designed to protect them from wolves, thieves, robbers, and any other sort of destructive force that might come after a sheep when it's not with its shepherd during the night. And so he's like, look, I am the door. I am the door. I am the access point in which the sheep go into and out of pasture and into and out of the fold. He's basically, if you read the whole context and you get to John 10 and you start hearing him talk about life, and then later he starts talking about his relationship with his Father and how it's the same relationship he's trying to give to us. The picture you get, and I'm jumping ahead on purpose here so we don't have to keep flip-flopping from verse to verse over and over again, but the picture you start to get as you walk through this thing, Jesus is the door. That means he's the access point into the life of the Father. He is the access point so that the life of the Father is now something that you can participate in and be a part of. He wants you to have access into the life of God. He wants you to have access into his life. He is the access point by which that happens. Verse 8, he's going to start to tell us now, without specifically naming names, but in a generic, vague sense, he's going to name a name. He's going to tell us who the thieves and robbers are. All who came before me are thieves and robbers. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. Now, a couple of things. You can interpret this too broadly and say, well, wait a minute. Did Jesus just say that, like, Moses is a thief and a robber? Did Jesus just say, like, every patriarch and every judge and prophet and Isaiah and every character in the Old Testament, Abraham, are they all thieves and robbers? No. Listen to what he says. All who came before me are, not were, are. So he's looking these Pharisees, he's looking at them. He's like, anybody who kind of showed up and they're here right now, but they came before me, thief and robber. They'll steal from you subtly without you realizing it, and sometimes they'll steal from you blatantly and you will realize it. And either way, you'll lose out, whether it's by subtlety and cunning or by force and burden, you will lose out. And so he's basically saying, you religious leaders that have been putting burdens on people's backs that even you yourselves can't carry, you're a thief and you're a robber. And so I'm quoting other times Jesus has addressed the Pharisees. You religious leaders that will travel 10 miles to make one disciple, but then you'll make them twice a son of hell than you are yourself. You're a thief and a robber. So this whole passage is actually about Jesus contrasting himself to other religious leaders, to other people that are messaging what God is supposedly saying and doing. And by the way, I take this very seriously because in a weird sense, 2,000 years later, I'm not saying I'm a Pharisee, I'm not saying I'm Jesus, but somewhere in there, as a person who ministers the word in public, and as a pastor, which really just means shepherd, by the way, as a pastor, there's a shepherding, onus and responsibility of a flock. I think of these thoughts. This is part of my thought process. And so that doesn't mean that I need to be infallible, but it does mean that I better not be putting on burdens on your back that you can't carry and that I myself can't carry. It does mean that I better be pointing you to the life of Jesus and him as the door and not me as the gatekeeper. It does mean that I better be pointing you to an abundant life that I can never give you in and of myself, but he can always give you. So there's an onus of responsibility on me and really on anybody who's a minister or a shepherd or whatever you want to call them, anyone who's functioning in this capacity. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, I'm glad I don't have to think about that. Well, hold on now. Just because we've created these social constructs where we call Tim pastor and we have this little white building with pews and a steeple, yeah, it works here, but you probably are shepherding people. You probably are representing Christ to people. It might be in a broad sense, it might be in a very specific sense, but there's probably people in your life that God has entrusted to you to shepherd, to care for, to guide. So you get some of this goodness too. You get to enjoy this too. It's actually not a hard gig. It's not, because really the job is to, and I'm going to reveal more than I probably intended to earlier than I intended to, but if you watch the pattern that unfolds, basically the concept, the repeated concept that begins to unfold over and over again is this. Whether you're a thief, a robber, a hired hand, or a wolf, your mode of operation and your motivation ends up being exploitation of the sheep. It ends up being, how do I serve my own agenda and purpose rather than the betterment and care and love for the sheep? And it becomes about what you want and your ministry or your will or your reputation or your vision of how things need to be or should be. And once it becomes about you and you've excluded Jesus as the primary focal point, that's when you start heading into these not great waters. I am the door, verse 9. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. Now here's another, what's the context here? You just heard the word saved, so what are you thinking? Heaven and hell. What else would you be thinking, of course? But is that really the context? No, the context, and then while that may be true, and maybe you can throw that in there as an example of what this salvation includes, I think the most immediate context is you'll be saved from this thievery and this robbing. You'll be saved from the outcome that I just watched unfold with this guy who was supposed to be, this is supposed to be a moment where God is glorified. He just got healed. And instead of this being a massive celebration throughout all of Jerusalem because the beggar who was born blind is now healed, his parents said, nope, not going to talk about that. His Pharisee leaders said, get out of here. And like now there's this drama and this controversy. Is Jesus from God or not? And like it became about this whole other thing. This is what Jesus is poking at. You will be saved from burdens that you cannot carry. You'll be saved from not having the abundant life of Christ residing and abiding in yours. You'll be saved from religious tomfoolery that would keep you from God's goodness and his love and his life. That's the context. And yeah, sure, heaven, hell, throw it in there. But that's not really what he's saying. I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. So we'll highlight this as well. Going in and going out and finding pasture. Man, it's hard to say those words without getting a picture of liberty and freedom and rest and sustenance and nourishment. Picture the sheep, like, you come in and out of this door, you have access freely. You have access to go and find rest and pasture. You have access to be nourished and cared for. You have access to protection. You have access to his life. You have access to the source of all things that are good. You have access is the point he's trying to make. And I think that's worth noting. I'll say it this way. If you're, and this is a weird thing for me to say because I would possibly be the culprit in this scenario, so hopefully this isn't true for any of you. But if you're in a place where you feel like you're being told, this is it, you can't find the Word of God anywhere else, it doesn't exist. There's no rest, there's no pasture, if you're in a place that's kind of stifling and controlling, that's kind of the opposite of the picture you get here. It's all about Jesus, so don't mishear me. I'm not saying go and find some non-Jesus expression, but I am saying, man, if Jesus is the focal point and there's life being proclaimed and there's life being released and there's rest, that's awesome. That's a good deal. Now, verse 10, where we started. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. Now remember, so far we have a thief and a robber. Interestingly enough, he almost picks the term you wouldn't think he'd pick for this. Because now that I've explained what the robber, remember the robber's the blatant one, the one that's going to hold you up at gunpoint. He's the one that's going to beat you up on the road to Jericho and leave you for dead in the ditch, and you hope a good Samaritan will come and save. The robber is the one that you know you're getting robbed. You know you're being taken advantage of. But here he says, actually, no, it's the thief that came or that comes only to steal and kill and destroy. The outcome of the thief is really the same as the outcome of the robber. What's scary, though, about the thief is you don't know what's happening while it's happening. And I think that's why Jesus hones in on this particular example. The real tragedy is when you lose God's freedom and rest and his life and his goodness along the way somewhere, and you don't even know what's happening until it's already fizzled out. And it's not that God's life is fizzled, it's that you have been so bound up in religious nonsense, garbage. You've been so bound up in the confusion of an approach to God that is an earn it and make your own way approach instead of God's grace that's freely given. There's somewhere along the way, if you begin to become your own savior because you have to go and do a bunch of stuff in order for you to invoke God's love, in order for you to invoke God's favor, in order for you to invoke God's pleasure in your life, in order for you to go and earn God's approval. If that's the place that you're in, you have been stolen from. Something has been destroyed. And by the way, something has already died or is dying. And you're like, well, I'm still breathing. Yeah, well, Adam still breathed after he ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But in that day, he surely did die. So when Jesus talks about dying, could it turn into a physical? Sure, in the most extreme example. But that's really not what he's talking about. He's talking about the same type of life and death that we were seeing in the Genesis account in the garden. God wants his life in you, and he wants you to be a full participant in the divine nature. That happens not because you earned it, it happens because you believed in the one that made it available. You believed in the access point, the door, and now you freely go and find pasture through that door. Freely come and go. In Hebrews, it talks about, therefore we approach the throne room of grace and get help in our time of need. We have freedom and confidence to stand in the presence of God. That's Romans. All right, we'll keep going. So I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I think Jesus got to a point in his metaphor where he's like, forget about the door, forget about shepherds, forget about everything else. I'm just going to tell you flat out, I came, forget about all the metaphors, I came so that you'd have life and have it abundantly. So he's like, I get it, you're confused by the symbolism. It's going over your head a little bit. So let me spell this part of it out to you without any hesitation, without any qualification. Here's why I came, so that you would have life and you would have it abundantly. We're going to see what that means a little bit later. We've already described a lot of it, but we'll get there. Verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. This is total nonsense in their cultural context. I don't care what kind of shepherd you are, you're going to kill those sheep at some point, or you're going to sell them off to be killed, or you're going to name them for, you're there to get a benefit from the sheep. Every shepherd is there to profit from the sheep. And Jesus is like, yeah, but I'm the good shepherd. I'm going to go and die for the sheep. I'm taking the shepherd metaphor and I'm going to pull it to the point of breaking it, because it's not even going to make sense to you anymore because you've never even thought of a shepherd that would do this for sheep. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. You're like, well, who's the hired hand and who's the wolf? He doesn't actually tell us, but I think you can make a good contextual argument and say this. They're the Pharisees. They're the thieves and the robbers. Remember, Jesus is using a multi-pronged approach to describe the same characters, the same concepts unfolding, and he's using just a multi-pronged approach, and it's a different mode of operation. So maybe you're not being exploited by religion in a sense where it's robbing you blatantly. Maybe you're not being exploited by a works-based approach to God where you're being thieved subtly. But maybe there's a hired hand who just doesn't actually care about you. So the moment that there is trouble, you've got no safety net, no backing, no support system. That's a dysfunctional church. I think our church is generally pretty good about that. There's always room for improvement, but I think in general our church is pretty good about supporting one another, lifting each other up. And again, if you're picturing Tim Haller in this role, you're not wrong, but please put me right next to your name, because you also are in this role in some capacity, right there. We are there for, we're members of one another. The wolf is it sounds like he's a snatcher and a scatterer through attack. I've seen this happen too. And I won't go into too much detail there, but if someone's, I'll call it ministry, if you could call it that, is one that scatters or snatches people away, that's a red flag. If somebody shows up trying to steal you away, that's a red flag. If somebody shows up and tries to scatter you, that's a red flag. And you might be like, well, how do you know that he's talking about the religious leaders? I won't go there. I'll save you the time. Acts chapter 20, Paul does this really cool thing. He's at the end of his life, seemingly. He thinks he's telling people, like, this is the last time you're going to see my face. And he's traveling from city to city, and each time he's like, I'm probably never going to see you guys again. He knows every city he travels to might be his last. He's going to be beaten. He's going to be thrown in jail. He's going to be killed, whatever. But he's ready to finish his race at this point. He calls a leadership conference, like a pastor's conference, and he has the leaders of the church at Ephesus and a few other places gather in Acts chapter 20, and he gives this speech, and in this speech he's talking about, look, you know me, you know what I've preached. I've preached the gospel of God's grace. And then he says, look, this gospel of God's grace, it's there to build you up and to give you an inheritance. Did you hear that? The gospel of God's grace that Paul was preaching and was so adamant about and was willing to die for is there to build you up and give you an inheritance. And then he says, look, after I'm gone, there are going to be people that rise up from among you, church leaders, that are wolves, ravenous wolves, and they will go against that gospel. So again, if you're hearing a quote-unquote gospel that's not there to build you up, it's not a gospel of grace, it's a gospel of something else. It's not there to give you an inheritance, not so you go and earn it. That's when you're dealing with a wolf situation potentially, as Paul described in Acts 20. All right, verse 13, we'll finish up here in a couple minutes. He flees because he's a hired hand and not concerned about the sheep. Covered that already. Verse 14, I am the good shepherd. He says it again. I know my own. Now he's going back earlier in the metaphoring and re-quoting it now that he's identified himself as the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. He's describing abundant life. Even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. This is abundant life. I'm going to read it again. I know my own, and my own know me, even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. Can you unpack that with me? Jesus just said that what I'm doing as the good shepherd, the abundant life, so I've came so that they might have life and have it abundantly. What that looks like is I'm going to have a connection with my sheep. They're going to know me, and I'm going to know them. We're going to be intimately connected the same way Father and I are connected. So you picture Jesus and you think like, wow, he's pretty tight with God. Like, look, he's doing miracles. He's hearing God's voice. He's doing all this stuff. He seems to really, really have this amazing connection and relationship with Father. And his entire life came out of that connection, that union. And Jesus is saying, look, yeah, abundant life is that. That's what you get to. That you'll have that with me. That's abundant life. I came so that they would have a life and have it abundantly, so that it'll be the same way I know Father, they're going to know me, and we're going to know one another. We're going to be connected in that way. Yeah, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. And even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Then he goes on to say, I have other sheep which are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. What does that mean? Not aliens. Not how Jesus traveled to North America and did some other stuff. There are people that actually believe both of those things in a bunch of... In context, what he's talking about is, look, I'm talking to a bunch of Jews in Jerusalem. The Gentiles, the non-Jews, have not yet received my ministry. They don't even know what I'm talking about. But there's coming a day very soon where they will hear my voice and they will follow it and will be one flock together. There'll be no division among you. Jews and Gentiles alike will all be part of this larger flock. That's what he's talking about. So I'm gonna close it out there and hand it over to Rach.
Thanks. Yeah, I find that parable to be one that I'm sure everyone in this room has read before, and like sometimes you're like, yeah, the Good Shepherd. I know all about that. Thanks. So I feel like that breakdown was really helpful, and what stood out to me is that I think that covers two of the most important things that we could ever talk about when getting together as a body. One being Jesus as the door, meaning that everything is possible through Jesus. And that means salvation for your eternal spirit, but it also means, when we talk about salvation as abundant life, that means more than enough now for you, body, soul, and spirit. So that means provision, that means happiness, that means joy, that means satisfaction in life, that means relationships with the people around you. That means physical wellness. Like that to me is, we could spend the entire morning talking about Jesus being that access point, and really Jesus being the access point of what the Father thinks about those things. Because it's really easy to get lost in the weeds. If you read the Bible from cover to cover, there's going to be some times where you're like, I'm not sure. I don't know what God is thinking in this moment. And the answer is, you got to test that through the door of Jesus. Like, what is that saying? And the second I think that, again, we could talk all day about is the voice of God, the voice of the shepherd. And my encouragement to you is, I think, if you know, it's like if you know, you know, right? So if you know the voice of God, you know what we're talking about here. But until that kind of like clicks into place, like the Tetris line disappears and you're like, oh, there we go, we've figured it out. Before that happens, it's kind of like, is it the audible voice of God? It's like, what does that really mean? And so I guess my encouragement closing out this message today is, if that seems nebulous or strange or like too much to ask for you, strike up a conversation with Tim or someone else in this body that you trust. Because if you can figure that out, if you can figure out how to invite the voice of God into your life, into your everyday life, in moments where it counts, in moments where it seems trivial, that is radical and life-changing. And really what makes Christianity stand out from what the rest of every other religious, like when we look at religious systems, you're like, wow, they seem to have found peace, they seem to have found whatever, but no one else offers God 24/7, 365, accessible at your fingertips, better than your fingertips, literally indwelling in you. And so I think we can't walk away from today without realizing like that is critical. And when we talk about unlocking abundant life, when we talk about like what does that look like through Jesus, but hearing the voice of the shepherd always. And again, it's that like to other sheep probably looks really weird. Like something happens and all of a sudden a bunch of people go one way, a bunch of sheep go one way. And really what is that? That's what it looks like when God speaks. And how like the world has changed when we look at like great movements of the past century. Like how did God move? God spoke to people and they heard his voice. And to those that know, and they said, yeah, I'm on board with that. And it's bewildering to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I just feel like I'm really glad you said what you said, Rach, because I do think his emphasis on hearing his voice and him knowing us by name individually is really one of the keys of this whole passage. And you really tied that together nicely. So I want to take 1 minute here, and otherwise I feel like I've done you a disservice. I said, yeah, well, go hear God's voice, and that's good for you. Go figure it out. What does that look like? Couple things to look for. First of all, generally speaking, it comes from within you, which means it's probably going to sound a little bit like you, because it's your inner voice. Now, does that mean everything inside of you, everything in your stream of consciousness is God? No, but it means some of it is, and so then it becomes a question of discernment. Well, how do I know what's from God and what's just whatever? And it's actually not that complicated. First of all, one thing to realize is you have your own unique relationship with God. And so how it plays out and what it looks like is going to be unique and specialized to you, but he is going to do it in a way that you can put your finger on and say, oh, that's it. As a general sense, though, I'll say this: you have the Holy Spirit living inside of you. The way I like to picture the Holy Spirit in some ways is just like there's a lie detector, a polygraph with a needle that goes like this. When someone is saying a lie, they're reading the biometrics, the blood pressure, the pulse, whatever, and they're saying, wow, that's a lie. You can hear it. The biometrics reveal it. Well, you have like spiritual biometrics inside of you, and instead of you having a lie detector, you have something called the Spirit of Truth, a truth detector, a God voice detector, a Jesus voice detector. There's a little needle called the Holy Spirit that's going to go like this on the inside when you hear something, whether it's from your inner voice or from a message or from whatever. When you hear God's voice and you know it's from you, that little truth detector is going to start to flicker. And it might not be a really super pronounced thing every time, but it'll always be there. Like, well, what does it feel like? What does it look like? It generally feels like him. What does he feel like? Well, he is peace. There's peace that transcends understanding. So if you feel a kind of a supernatural peace, let that peace be your umpire, is the way it describes it in Colossians 15. Let the peace of God be the umpire in your heart. Let it decide whether or not the ball is a strike or a ball, or a home run or a foul ball. Let that umpire of his peace help you discern. If you feel faith rise up in your heart as the voice comes, if you feel faith accompanying what's being spoken, that's a really good indicator of the truth needle starting to flicker. Why? Because faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. So if you feel faith or peace or even his joy enveloping something, it's like, man, if I could feel his presence or I could feel faith rising up, that's a strong indicator to me that my truth detector is starting to flicker. And once you start doing this as a practice, you start doing this every day, now it doesn't become this huge, I'll say, gymnastics routine where you're trying to do backflips to hear Jesus, and you're trying to do, let me pray for 4 hours after I fasted for 10. Like, no, just ask God a question. It also helps to be specific. So if you want to hear him specifically, talk to him specifically. If you're trying to work through a situation, talk to him about the situation specifically. Ask him specific questions and wait for the response. Let that voice begin to rise up. And does it mean that everything inside of you is him? Probably not, but a lot of it is. A lot of it is him, and it's us just kind of skipping right over it because there's this little truth detector needle that we haven't trained ourselves to pay attention to, but it's there.